Hello, and welcome to today's ACM Learning webinar. This webcast is part of ACM's commitment to lifelong learning and professional development, serving a global membership of computing professionals and students. I'm Eve Anderson, Director at Google AI, where I lead the machine learning fairness and accessibility engineering teams. I'm also an ACM member as well as a volunteer, as chair of the ACM Professional Development Committee and member of the Practitioners Board. To learn more about my background, check out the bio widget on your screen. For those of you who may be unfamiliar with ACM or what it has to offer, here's more information. ACM offers educational and professional development resources that bolster skills and enhance career opportunities. Our members can stay competitive in the constantly changing world of computing with a range of ACM learning resources at learning.acm.org. A few highlights of Learning Center resources are shown on your screen. ACM recognizes the role of computing in driving the innovations to sustain competitiveness in a global environment. ACM provides timely computing information published by ACM, including communications of the ACM and Q magazines, access to the ACM Digital Library, the world's most comprehensive database of computing literature, international conferences that draw leading experts on a broad spectrum of computing topics, support for education and research, including curriculum development, teacher training, the ACM Turing and ACM Prize and Computing Awards, and the newly updated ACM Code of Ethics, a collection of principles and guidelines designed to help computing professionals make ethically responsible decisions in professional practice. ACM enables its members to solve critical problems using new technology that enriches our lives and advances our society in the digital age. Before we get started, I'd like to quickly mention a few housekeeping items shown on the slide in front of you. First, the slides will advance automatically throughout the event. On the bottom panel, you will find a number of additional widgets and resources. If you're experiencing problems with the slides or audio, press the F5 key in Windows, Command R if you're on a Mac, or refresh your browser on a mobile device. Or you can close and relaunch the presentation. To control volume, adjust the master volume on your computer. If you have questions during this webinar, please type them into the Q&A box at any time during the webinar and click the Submit button. I'll organize the questions as Jen and Nithya speak, and they'll reserve time at the end of the presentation to address them. The session is being recorded and will be archived. You'll receive an automatic email notification when it becomes available. And check learning.acm.org for updates on this and other upcoming webcasts. At the end of the presentation, you'll see a survey open on your screen. Please take a minute to fill it out to help us improve our webinars. You may also open the link to the survey at any time from the resources window on your screen. You can use the Facebook and Twitter widgets on the bottom panel to share the presentation link with your friends, as well as tweet comments and questions using the hashtag ACMLearning. We'll be watching for your tweets. We also have a new community discourse page to continue the discussion after this webcast, including questions we won't be able to get through during the Q&A session. Today's presentation is Building a Culture to Support Inclusive Design by Jen Devins and Nithya Sambasivan. Jen leads the Accessibility UX team and works to make Google products universally accessible by developing new standards and consulting with teams on accessibility design practices and guidelines. She has also worked as a user experience design manager on products such as Google Search and Google Analytics. Nithya Sambasivan is a senior researcher leading research on underrepresented communities for the Next Billion Users team at Google. Her research has covered topics such as internet access, grid electrification, crisis response, civic engagement, and more in the Global South, and has influenced large-scale real-world projects like Google Station, Baytally, Build for Billions, and more. Jen and Nithya are both ACM members, and you can learn more about their backgrounds and research interests in the bio widget. Jen and Nithya, without further ado, Take it away.
Hi, we are Nithya and Jen, and we work in the areas of accessibility, gender equity, and artificial intelligence. Over the years, we've been building equitable technologies for underrepresented communities around the world. And in today's talk, we're going to share some of our lessons learned and a practical framework to apply equitable design and research in your work. Even though 1 billion people in the world have some form of a disability, according to the Business Disability Forum, 70% of websites in the UK were inaccessible on a basic level. Consider a common mechanism that we encounter online to distinguish humans from robots, which is CAPTCHAs. These are Turing tests to make users identify obscure text. However, these tasks inherently exclude people with disabilities. A CAPTCHA can be very difficult or even impossible for people who are blind, have low vision, or people with dyslexia. ProPublica reported on how a predictive algorithm to identify recidivism was particularly likely to falsely flag Black defendants as future criminals at almost twice the rate as white defendants. Risha Borden and her friend Sade Jones were 2 teenage girls who committed a petty crime. Despite being their first time, they were classified as medium risk, and it's argued that knowing this risk, the judge raised the bond amount for each girl from the recommended $0 to $1,000 each. Women all over the world may face regular online harassment, misogyny, and trolling. Rana Ayub, a senior Indian journalist, discusses how she has been repeatedly attacked using online platforms through hate speech, Photoshop tweets, and deep-fake porn videos made of her. One of the ways in which women respond is by reducing their online participation and presence. Only 8% of Wikipedia contributors are women, for example, because of harassment. Are technology makers intentionally discriminatory, racist, or misogynist? Why do these incidents happen? There could be a number of reasons, but you could argue that the people involved are ethical themselves, and yet this seems to happen. Today, we can launch an app that can be made instantly available globally. Therefore, when we miss an entire population or context, it can lead to unintended consequences. And at scale, this can be a really big problem, something we struggle to deal with because both technology and society are both very complex structures. Technology is not a value-neutral medium. It has properties that can include or exclude communities depending on their social, cultural, or economic positions. Unintentional exclusion has the same impact as intentional exclusion. It does not matter what the intentions are, only the outcomes matter. The good news is that there is a shift in the technology community and media zeitgeist in what our responsibilities are. Equity is much more important than ever before. It's no longer an optional or a nice to have, it has become mandatory. So our talk today is about making equitable choices in technology development. We are here to share with you a framework that we have found effective in driving our own inclusion-based initiatives. You could be single-handedly making a change in a product feature, have an organizational mandate, or lead a dedicated and funded initiative. And our talk aims to share some best practices for a variety of use cases.
We recognize that it's hard to start equality or equity initiatives in organizations. This is what we're presenting today is not a formula, but more of a framework of how to think about equitable design. Our framework was drawn from our work in gender equity, online, and accessibility.
For gender equity, we draw our insights from and design process from having conducted mixed methods research in 7 countries, from Brazil to Indonesia. And we've spent the past 2 years working with Google product teams to incorporate the insights and sharing our work externally in academic, public policy, and industry venues.
For accessibility, we drew our insights from our work to establish a product design and development culture that adopts an accessibility-first mindset. This work started with foundational research with people with disabilities to understand their needs and pain points so that product teams could help address them. In parallel, we observed how teams were motivated, how they worked, and how they prioritized work, and in order to understand ways to make this accessibility-first mindset part of the culture. Okay, so let's now walk through ways to make a case for equity. Some of the common challenges that may be faced include people being unclear about how this work would fit with the overall business goals. You might have challenges getting this prioritized over competing interests. And sometimes you might find that people are just generally uncomfortable with the implications of being asked to focus on equity. Let's start with how to demonstrate how this work can support organizational goals. It's common to start with the ethical case. The ethical case can be made by getting stories from users that are impacted. Doing your own research is ideal, but if you don't have the resources or time, there are actually many stories and reports online that can illustrate the impacts of non-inclusive products and what that impact is on a person. This is important and can definitely get the attention of teams and leaders, but sometimes it's just not enough. In addition, you can think about making that a technical challenge for teams to solve. Pose these unmet needs as problems that could be solved with new technologies such as machine learning and AI. It's also extremely useful and important to make the business case. You can focus on how inclusive design can drive product growth because it often taps into new markets. Creating more inclusive products and establishing a more inclusive work environment can also be used as a differentiator from competitors when it comes to hiring or selling your product. Another tactic to make a strong case with your partner teams is to partner with teams that have very similar goals, such as privacy and internationalization or localization. You can package these efforts to leadership as work that's required to create robust products and find ways that you can possibly consolidate processes so you're not coming at teams as yet another process or yet another thing that teams have to focus on. It could be one cohesive group of requirements that teams need to follow. Ask if your product has considered all the stakeholders. What if it negatively impacts before? Is that really what was intended? It's important to understand the experience from different user groups to help paint a more realistic picture of the experiences being designed and launched. This requires a growth mindset to be open to opposite views and strengthen your product, but it is very critical. Now, framing is really important with this work. Jen and Valar, an AI ethicist, noted that sometimes personal ethics can actually deeply conflict with professional ethics, such as being for animal rights but having to do testing on animals per your job. Therefore, teams or individuals might feel that their personal ethics are being attacked. Another issue that comes up is team members just might not feel comfortable talking about the topic overall due to a fear of offending others. Even if awkward at first, it's good to have these discussions. In order to help, you can provide some ground rules, allow quiet voices to speak up, and establish a common vocabulary for teams to rely on. Finally, this can be really unfamiliar territory for some people and teams, and they might not understand what is the actual goal from being inclusive, and what does an inclusive product actually look like. Share some examples to help illustrate the point. One good example is the Shirley card, which was used by Kodak to set skin tone standards. The photograph was of a white woman, and therefore photography's skin tone standard was based on white skin for many decades until the 1990s. So that what happened is when darker skinned people were photographed, they looked much darker. You can also create your own examples as well by piloting an inclusive design process within a team, and therefore you can create your own case study to use as leverage later.
To walk you through an example from our work on gender equity on how we frame the case, A fairly non-traditional topic for a product organization, we started off by analyzing the access landscape. How many women were online today in the world? And we learned that the gender deficit by owning phones decreased by about 8% in the past few years. So there's tremendous progress going on here. We also built an ethical case for gender around advancing human rights and creating an inclusive design space. And finally, we built a technical case around how our products can address new computing challenges in privacy, safety, and machine learning that we can arrive at the intersection of gender equity and technology. We also got initial support from a few products, which demonstrated the potential impact we were likely to have and help build confidence.
For accessibility, as I kind of mentioned before, we found that, but it's just as important to get teams to understand the untapped market of people with disabilities, such as the fact that over $8 trillion are out there of collectible disposable income of people with disabilities and their friends and families worldwide. And there's $21 billion in discretionary income of working-age people with disabilities in the United States. And that's really important to know, right? And in some cases where teams feel that there aren't many people with disabilities in their user base, a great concept to share is that when we focus on people with permanent disabilities, such as somebody in a wheelchair or someone who isn't blind, we're also solving for people with temporary and situational impairments. So a temporary disability or impairment is an example of that is somebody that has a broken arm and is less mobile than normal. And a situational impairment example is somebody holding a bag of groceries or a child in one arm, and again, is not as mobile as they'd like to be. In addition to that, one thing we found useful recently is to also form this similar conversation in the terms of usability. So you can also talk about it from the perspective of what is our eyes-free and hands-free experience, or what's the experience for somebody when they're in a partially audible situation.
Once we've made the case, how can we create a foundation of knowledge and principles to act upon? Some of the resistances that one might encounter in creating an equitable foundation are lack of clarity on what knowledge, tools, or resources would be valuable for teams, not knowing when to stop or when the foundation is strong enough to build off of. From the research side, when do we know that something is evergreen and long-lasting and can be broadly applicable versus becoming expired in a few months? Not enough resources like people and budget to build a foundation is another common challenge. Start by conducting foundational research on the problem space to get an understanding of diverse user practices and needs. There is no substitute for actually interacting and learning from the communities you're building for. Use this knowledge to build empathy for various teams via videos, reading transcripts, direct interviews, which will help you create a foundation that gets internalized by the teams and is remembered past the presentation. However, we may not always have enough resources. A highly scalable and efficient way is to partner with other organizations for research like NGOs, research institutions, and universities that may be specialists in working with the communities. Use what's already out there. There is a fairly good amount of equitable design work on the internet or through secondary literature. Another way to gather diverse viewpoints is to make existing efforts more inclusive, such as in doing research, sample for gender balance, for people with disabilities, or the LGBTQ+ community in your existing work so that participants are more diverse and the claims are more broadly valid. To create a design foundation, you could audit your products using existing checklists like the W3C guidelines or our emerging markets framework to assess the current state and evaluate problems. In the Gender Equity Online initiative, our challenge was that we were a small team, one researcher, one designer, and one program manager. How could we create a lasting foundation of relevant insights across various emerging markets and apply to in our case, various Google products. Firstly, we constructed a research approach to do research in 7 countries and to do comparative research using multiple methods. We worked with several NGOs that work with communities like LGBTQ members, female genital mutilation survivors, abuse survivors, women with disabilities, HIV-positive women, and technology communities like Google Research Scholars and Lean In. We also attended several community events like Pride Marches in India. Sensitivity is key to equitable research because of the likely marginality of the communities that we're engaging with. So we took 3 to 4 months to establish an ethical research protocol, such as guidelines on how to conduct research in neutral and safe sites, same-gender moderation, data anonymization, and more. In order to learn about women in various emerging markets, we established university partnerships in Pakistan, Bangladesh, Brazil, and Mexico that helped us scale the research, learn from the regional experts, and build academic ties. So we conducted our research for a year and a half, and we ended up with a mountain of data and findings. But we wanted to structure this vast research into one visual and memorable framework, which is now broken into access, content, privacy, and safety. This is a visual and framework that gets referenced over and over again in various meetings and workshops, and has helped distill the key message into one slide.
When creating a foundation for accessibility products, we learned that there's a rather steep learning curve to understand how to truly design and develop good, accessible products. Since our goal was to get all teams to focus on this work, we knew that they would greatly benefit from a solid foundation of guidelines, tools, and processes that they can start with. As mentioned earlier, we started with foundational research, such as field studies and interviews with people with disabilities, and developed useful resources, such as the day in the life videos and personas for teams to work from, and using common activities such as brainstorms and design sprints. We also developed our accessibility design guidelines, which we integrated with the material design system, so any designer or developer coming to material design would be thinking about accessibility. In addition, we also observed teams' workflows to identify gaps and opportunities to integrate accessibility. One example of this is thinking about how designers work, and they often have design reviews. So we talked to people to ask if they could actually include and just basically discuss accessibility in those design reviews to really truly make it part of the discussion and the culture. And similarly with research, we're always looking for opportunities for anyone to include people with disabilities in their research. Finally, you want all of this initial hard work and gaining buy-in and building a foundation to pay off and drive sustainable impact. Some of the common challenges around driving sustainable impact are that teams might, that you might face the fact that these efforts sometimes lose momentum due to personal challenges or new priorities. Teams might be unclear on how to do equitable design and development, and teams might feel overwhelmed or discouraged because it's seen as new hard work or that they'll never make everyone happy. This may be pretty obvious, but it's definitely worth calling out. We're really talking about a culture change here. So it's important for team members to feel involved in driving the effort as well as getting agreement from leadership that this is a desired goal. Whatever goal setting system that you have, OKRs, quarterly goals, etc., it's important to get formal long-term goals around equitable design on everyone's agenda and to have teams be held accountable. And as with any project, it's critical to have good success metrics. With equitable design, the teams or individuals who design and build the equitable products might not always notice or have a direct impact of their work. So it's even more important to communicate how they're doing and the impact of their work overall. It not only motivates the teams, but demonstrates the value of the work. So some examples of success metrics include adoption by more diverse users, fewer complaints from diverse users, positive press stories, And on the organizational side, you might see that new products are being created using an inclusive design process. When building a foundation, a pool of resources are needed to be created. To bring more individuals and teams on board long-term, creating a comprehensive toolkit of resources can be extremely helpful. You can help anyone understand how and when to use the resources. Also, one tip that we've learned is when you're creating these resources, sometimes it might seem overwhelming because there are so many, so you try to streamline them, but give users a way to get started quickly. So offer one thing that they can start with just to kind of get their feet wet and get engaged in the process. Workshops are also very useful in creating sustainability and driving sustainability. We've seen that these workshops and actually bringing teams together, working on products and projects and problems that are really critical to them is a really clear way to get them engaged in this work and thinking about how it's relevant to their work.
Jen and I have diametrically opposite training challenges with our research communities. Accessibility is an area that many people may not have closely encountered, whereas gender is an all too familiar and in fact a personal and subjective topic for most people. We have worked with various teams to conduct workshops and apply the research insights into product features, designs, or go-to-market plans. Teams usually bring their metrics and product expertise to the table. We bring the gender expertise, and together we co-create solutions. Unlike traditional sprints where research is typically shared in the form of lightning talks, followed by user journeys, and then to product definition, we make the insights the centerpiece of the workshops, dividing them into access, content, privacy, and safety sessions, and deep dive into these various aspects of the product. We had to help teams unlearn what they knew about gender, especially from their vantage points in the Silicon Valley. We had a translation challenge with converting gender equity insights into product features and decisions, going from sociological insights to very technical design decisions. Therefore, we used an array of activities to apply the insights into products. First, we introduced to the teams how to talk about gender and share an introduction to feminism so that we could use a shared vocabulary that makes us all comfortable using terms that are respectful. Then we used scenarios. For example, we learned from our research that women tend to share their phones more often because of societal norms. And by sharing these scenarios on device sharing, we could then identify how the product should respond in various use cases. And these workshops typically are multi-day workshops. And to break up the monotony, we also experiment with quizzes, like identifying if content is fake or not. And women, being largely on social media, may encounter more health-related and money-related fake content. Our approach has been to share our work widely inside and outside of Google to enable change with gender equity. We presented our work besides at various Google fora, externally at the United Nations headquarters, World Bank, Google I/O, conferences like SIGCHI, SOUPS, and many other fora.
To drive sustainable impact in accessibility, over time we created a playbook of resources, process, and other information needed for teams to be successful. We established key events such as an accessibility week to reinvigorate teams as well as showcase the great work being done. Finally, to scale the work, we established a champion program where volunteers are trained up to focus on accessibility within their teams, train their teams, and identify ways to make their own product development process more inclusive. But one thing we do note is that a key thing with a program like this is to also ensure that those champs are being recognized and rewarded accordingly so that this does continue to drive the work going forward.
To recap, our talk today focused on, one, how to make the case for equitable design through business, technical, or ethical cases, or a combination of all of these. Two, how do we create a foundation of principles and insights through which we can make design decisions and engineering decisions off of? And this is by talking to diverse community members to understand their needs and practices. And three, how can we achieve sustainable impact through goals, metrics, and workshops that integrate into bloodstreams of product organizations? There are plenty of resources online on how to get started and learn more about this space. Here are some starting points, and you can always get in touch with us if you have further questions. Equity is an inherently challenging topic. There are no set rules or formulae or templates here, but it is possible. There are many ways to define and achieve equity. It's a pluralistic enterprise. Equitable design is not just about products dedicated to underrepresented communities. Any project can be equitable. You have to question the positive and negative impacts of any work that we take up. If there's one thing that we would like you to take away from this talk, it is to ask the tough questions. Because if we don't, then who will? We'll leave you on this slide with how to contact us and further resources. Here's Eve.
Thank you very much, Jen and Nithya. Let's move on to the questions and answers. Our first question here is, this looks like it is one that could go to either of you, so let me know who wants to answer. Do you have examples of how you've translated diversity goals and metrics into business results? That is usually the hardest point to get through to business decision makers.
So some of the key ways that we've been able to do this is thinking about how, again, tapping into reaching these untapped markets can actually increase the number of sales. One thing to think about if you're ever in thinking or in the enterprise space or getting into education space, a lot of times accessibility is a requirement, and so that's kind of just the entry point to even getting into that space, which can really drive the business case there.
Similarly, for gender equity, we have framed the case with the various product teams as a growth opportunity. Today, women are underrepresented online. 2/3 of countries have fewer women than men online. But framing it as a deficit is not particularly helpful or sustainable. Instead, we frame it as product and user growth that can happen by addressing these inequities and better user experiences that can arise as a result. So rather than Band-Aid fixes, we try to frame it as strategic growth opportunities.
All right. Thank you, both of you. I have a question that came from the discourse discussion group. In co-design and inclusive design, how can the process be tailored to involve persons with cognitive and communication impairments? And the person who asked the question, their research is in developing digital rehab apps for language impairments after a stroke. I think this would be a Jen question.
So one of the ways we've been thinking about approaching this is, as often you're unable to get the participants or get the people with these actual disabilities into the research, is to talk to caregivers and therapists. This has been a really valuable way to gain these insights if you're unable to actually bring in the actual users. But that isn't to say that you shouldn't also try to talk and engage with the actual users. There are a number of ways to do this. And there are kind of similar to what Nithya was talking about, just ethical approaches to this type of research that are out there and identified. But we've definitely found that it's very useful to also talk to that other group of people that are involved in the person's life. And we've gained very valuable insights.
Thank you for that. All right, we have another accessibility question here. How do you strike a happy medium between elegant design and accessibility? Can you cite an example where you had to compromise between a fully accessible solution and a simpler, more elegant design?
For the most part, what we've seen in our practice, especially in our workshops where we tend to take existing designs and help teams work through them, making them accessible, the thinking about accessibility actually had improved the sites and the design overall. So a generic example might be thinking about how many, we often have teams think about how to work through a navigation experience on a site, thinking about it from the perspective of a keyboard user. And when you actually do that and think through that, oftentimes you'll notice that there are a number of steps that a user has to go through. And you're just not considering that when you're thinking about it from the perspective of a mouse user. And so when you go to this, you often identify a number of ways to just simplify the overall experience. In addition, similar to that, another good example we found is, as far as a way to improve the UI of something is, and make it accessible, are date pickers. Date pickers are out there and probably in almost every app we use. And oftentimes these date pickers are presented in a pop-up dialog with the number of dates and stuff. And so kind of back to that keyboard analogy, if you think about how many key presses it would take to choose like a 25th date, it's quite a lot. So by simply adding a text field to a date picker as another way to accomplish and input a date is extremely useful. And then as far as when we talk about elegant design, I assume maybe you're referring to more visual design. And this is certainly an area where we do hear a lot of, oh, now that I have to make my design accessible, does that mean it needs to be stark black and white and there's no hierarchy? And again, similarly, we found that by pushing the designers to think about other ways that you can introduce hierarchy, it actually ends up creating a much more elegant design because you're not relying just on one aspect of design, such as color.
Thank you. This question, I think, is also more along Jen's lines. Is there anything in particular that should be kept in mind for senior citizens?
Yes, definitely. Actually, most of the accessibility guidelines that we follow directly impact positively senior citizens. So many of the standards that we focus on are around ensuring that there's good color contrast. So this is really important for older users as, like many people, lose their sight degrades over time, right? So ensuring that there's good contrast is very helpful. Ensuring that that font sizes are decent size. There are no strict requirements around that, but making sure that they're large enough or that a user can actually enlarge them. Some other things to consider are making sure that the UI itself is straightforward, and this is good for anybody, but the UI text, that it's clear and concise. That if you have any sort of workflows, you don't have to recall a bunch of information going from screen to screen, as that impacts the cognitive overload. There are a number of other ones to consider. So as we age again, often our dexterity degrades as well, and this can impact the way, like how steady we can hold a mouse or how we're able to type on a phone. So when you're talking mobile design, we talk a lot about ensuring that our touch targets sizes are large enough so that it can accommodate people that might not be so accurate in their presses. So if you're focused on that user base in particular, I would just reference any sort of standard accessibility design guidelines because they overlap very much with that audience.
All right, the next question I think is probably relevant for both or either of you. When you're making an inclusive design, when you're doing user testing, at what points during the development process does it happen? Do you consider it during the design process, at the end when you have a final app or website, or when are the best times to do user testing?
As a researcher, I would say the whole life cycle, and the sooner we start, the better our product definitions get and the more inclusive they get, rather than retrospective fixes or tactical fixes. For example, considering various underrepresented groups like women or people with disabilities, in the foundational research stage, when we're starting to define the problem space, understand what exists out there, what are current user practices, and in figuring out what is the role of technology here and what should we be even putting forth. Some of these insights can be particularly helpful in knowing, well, who is this product for and what should it do. And later on, when the ideas get more solidified, when the product design gets more solidified and we enter iterative cycles to improve the user experience, once again, including a diverse user base in the user research can be really helpful so that it doesn't inherently skew towards making the experience better for mainstream populations. And then when the product is launched out there, it's useful to define a broader approach to understanding and evaluating the product in terms of logs as well as qualitative interviews with again, a diverse set of users. So I think the entire life cycle, and there's different values to or different impacts that can come from engaging with a diverse set of users at different stages so that it's overall an inclusive product.
Yeah, and I would just add to that we've certainly seen too that if you do wait until the end, there are significant costs to that, just in the sense of having to retrofit anything, which always takes extra work and time. So if there's ever a need in your situation, you need to make a case for kind of moving that thinking and that work forward in the design process. That's one thing that you can always kind of reference, that the retrofitting and rework is a significant cost and doesn't make anybody happy.
Thanks. Okay, I'm going to take a couple things quickly myself. One is that one of our listeners has recommended a good site, which is eldereye.com. So all of you can check that out if you're interested. Another quick one, I'm just going to answer myself. Will you be at CSUN next week? Yes, indeed we will. I think we'll have several dozen people from across Google, probably different countries as well, who will be at CSUN. CSUN's one of the biggest accessibility conferences in the world for those who are unfamiliar with it. So see you there. Okay, so let's answer another question. Okay, this is a question about terminology. How would you distinguish between equitable design and universal design, or are they one and the same?
I think in principle they're pretty similar. I wouldn't say that there's a drastic difference between the two. They're all getting at the same goal of building technologies that are meaningful and make sense to different types of people. I think to some degree, universal design has its historical context rooted in accessibility, whereas equitable design or of late, the notion of equity has been coming up a lot, especially with topics around algorithmic bias and surveillance and more recent intersections with technology and society. it might also be a more current term, but my take is that they're both similar. It depends on who you're talking to and what they respond to.
Thank you. Okay, here's another question. Is there work on getting higher educators to embed the best practices into the classrooms?
So yes, there is an organization called Teach Access, and probably others out there that are involved, and their main focus is working with key universities to embed accessibility into engineering education, design education, and others. So this is an active group that's currently, I'm actually not sure which exact universities they're working with right now, but it is an active network that's continually working on creating new curriculum, as well as just general best practices and engagement opportunities between companies and universities. So yes, this is key work going on.
All right, we have somebody who would like to know about mobile accessibility standards. So there are some well-known web accessibility standards, and this wasn't part of the question, but some of the listeners might be familiar with WCAG, which is the W3C Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, if I'm remembering the acronym correctly. And the questioner would like to know, is there anything that is similar on the mobile side?
So in WCAG, there is a small section of mobile design guidelines in there, so that's worth looking at. And then also on the material design site, so Google Material site, which is material.io, there is a section in there on accessibility where we do cover a number of guidelines that span both web and mobile. And for the most part, though, the standards and guidelines are very similar, and there's a lot of overlap. Some of the unique ones are around, again, touch target sizes, but even that is kind of merging into the web space now that we have so many hybrid laptops with touch screens. Some other things that you consider are around orientation and making sure that your products or applications appear well on landscape versus portrait mode. So there are some distinct things, but there is also a lot of overlap. So I suggest checking out the material.io site for you.
All right, and this next question is along the same lines around accessibility, or around standards, actually, but I think this question is more directed to Nithya. So the question is, are the W3C accessibility standards still relevant? And I think the answer to that part is yes. But then the second part is interesting. So they say, back when I was doing web design, they were important, but if I recall correctly, they didn't address gender or cultural equity much. So are there standards, Nithya, that you think would address those aspects?
Yeah, I think to answer your question, if we look at the technologies that are being used around the world, they tend to be largely mobile first and mobile only, which means a combination of web and mobile applications. So guidelines that help address better and inclusive design of both applications as well as mobile renderings of websites can be really useful. We at Google have a set of resources on design.google/NBU. NBU stands for Next Billion Users. So this URL is a collection of best practices and design guidelines on building for people around the world, and includes topics like design sprints, prototyping, evaluation guidelines, and much more. And we also have a special collection there on accessibility defined more globally. And so here we look at the intersection of accessibility with aspects like uneven connectivity, varying device sizes and infrastructures, the inherent social and cultural norms of people with disabilities who may be further marginalized in different parts of the world. So we put out a collection of design articles there, which also links to an IO talk that we gave last year.
Okay, this next question is a hard one, in my opinion, based on some of my experience in the field. How do you recruit a broad range of users for testing? One difficulty we have is getting users to test products at all stages of product design and development. So users, a broad range of users. How do you go about finding these users?
So one of the main ways people often start with is reaching out to organizations that focus on people with disabilities. And so I suggest starting there. It's a great relationship to form with the organization, and then ideally have a pool of users to pull from. I think a lot of people struggle with finding users to continually come into this. So there are some more unique things that are coming about, which I think are fantastic. For example, there is a Facebook group now that is used to collect or have people sign up to be in user tests, and then companies can reach out and access them or put out a post and saying that they're actually doing some user studies. So there's different ways to go about it. The other thing to think about and consider, depending on the size of your organization and stuff, is especially if you're doing things early on and you want to get to some quick feedback, that there are ways to go about doing that, doing such things as heuristic evaluations, where if you're somewhat well-versed in accessibility or know somebody that is, you can kind of run through your product and looking at a set of heuristics to understand if it's meeting kind of basic guidelines. And that's just a quick way to get an initial gauge before then bringing in users from the outside. But yeah, I would start with some of the organizations that are around, and good luck with that.
All right, this next question is a very practical one about accessibility. Are there online tools we can use to examine a site to make recommendations about accessibility?
Yes, so currently for the web, there are a few that we have. So in Google Chrome, we do have in the development tools area, there is an accessibility checker baked into that. So it's for your websites. There are other checkers out there. AXE is another one that's used a lot. On mobile side, Google, we do have an Android accessibility scanner that allows anyone to quickly scan an application. And for both or all of these tools, the main thing it does is essentially scan the site and raise issues that map to, for the most part, a lot of the WCAG standards or just general accessibility standards, such as contrast, sizes of icons and touch targets and things like that. So yes, there are a decent amount of tools out there, which is great.
Thank you, Jen. This question is for Nithya. What kind of accessibility is needed to make a site accessible to women?
So if we define accessibility more broadly as helping people make use of an experience, then considering women in the design and development process entails thinking about various aspects of gender and the user experience. It could start from whether women have access to the technology itself, How regularly do they access mobile phones? What's the cost of using internet on a mobile phone? In consideration with other structural factors, like women may have lower purchasing power because there may be fewer women that have livelihoods in different parts of the world, or that because of structural factors, again, there may be fewer women who have the opportunity to go to school. So thinking about literacy, affordability, devices, and infrastructures as sort of the foundation is useful. And then as we examine other factors of usage of technology, then considering gender also opens up a space around aspects like relevance of the content. Is the content meaningful to different user groups? For example, do women find content that is enriching their lives versus, say, purely entertainment content? Or given the fact that there are fewer women online than men are in many parts of the world, recommendation engines or suggestions may skew inherently towards a larger majority of users than being inclusive. And then there are other aspects to consider with gender and technology, such as privacy, safety, which opens up considerations around do women feel comfortable using the technology? Are they able to secure their identities? And do they feel that they have control over their online presence and engagement, given that they may be more prone to harassment and trolling? And is the technology meaningful both digitally, but also are women able to take it into their daily context of their lives? For example, being out on the streets, being in public transportation, does the technology have sufficient safety features to act as a companion and respond positively there?
Thank you. I just want to read one more comment from one of the audience members. It relates back to the question that Jen just answered about tools. This person said that the Wave plugin is excellent and easy to use. So the Wave plugin is a Chrome extension. I don't know if there are other formats as well, but I'm familiar with the Chrome extension. And it is made by WebAIM, which is a really great group that works on web accessibility. So she recommends that this is a great tool for you to use with links to WCAG to learn more. So thank you for that addition. So I'm afraid that we are out of time for today. I'd like to thank Jen and Nithya again for their informative presentation and insightful answers to the many questions. We got through quite a few today. A special thanks to each of you out there for taking the time to attend and participate today. This webinar was recorded and it will be available online in a few days at webinar.acm.org. You can find announcements on upcoming webinars and other ACM activities at learning.acm.org and at acm.org. Also, please fill out our quick survey where you can suggest future topics or speakers. The survey can be accessed from your screen right now. On behalf of the ACM, Jen Devins, Nithya Sambasivan, and myself, Eve Anderson, thanks again for joining us, and I hope you will join us again in the future. This concludes the webinar.